Well, I've done the maths, and it seems like there's 8,800 tons of spent fuel at the site, or maybe rounded off to 10,000 tons of spent fuel at just that site at the Fukushima Daichi reactor complex. And that hasn't included spent fuel pools at units 5 and 6. So I wonder how much spent fuel Japan has in toto, Arnie Gundersen.
Oh, I don't know, Helen. They're all old plants, and some like Tokai only have 2 units, and Onagawa has 3. So they vary, but I'm sure you can. There's 50 reactors, and I'm sure you can say at least 600 bundles for each reactor, perhaps more. So that's 600 tons per reactor times 50 reactors. It's a big number. So
30,000 tons.
Okay. That's the minimum. Yeah.
Minimum, more.
Now,
yeah.
Now the beauty of Unit 4 is that there's nothing in the nuclear reactor. So as they go up, as you go to 1, 2, and 3, of course, you've got to empty the fuel pools, and that's not clear, especially Unit 3, how much damage is in the fuel pool. I think the damage in Unit 3's pool is extensive. But then you got to get in the nuclear reactors on 1, 2, and 3. And, of course, the fuel is melted down there, so it's not as simple as grabbing the bundles and lifting them out. The fuel is actually, melted, and there's a blob on the bottom of the reactor if you're lucky, and in fact, more likely has leaked through the reactor and is a blob on the concrete. So it's they're going to be much more difficult than Unit 4.
Well, I mean, the only time they've ever tried to remove melted fuel was at 3 Mile Island, and that took them 10 years, didn't it?
Yes. And
but that wasn't really melted like the way these 3 have really...
Right. That way, TMI had a blob of nuclear fuel on the bottom, but it hadn't breached a vessel. All of these vessels have been breached. The control rods come in at the bottom, and they're leaking like a sieve. So what fuel, it is likely that fuel has oozed out through the control rods. If not burned its way right out, it's likely Unit 2 has burned its way right out and is now lying on the concrete. So, and I think that's really the big change in my view of the problem is what they're finding in Units 1, 2, and 3 now.
What?
So let's think of the nuclear reactor as a pressure cooker.
Okay.
And the nuclear reactor is in a containment. So we'll build a real strong box around the pressure cooker. Mm. And then the containment is in another building called the tourist building and the reactor building. And then next to that building is the turbine building. So we've got like 3 or 4 different buildings here. We are finding in the turbine buildings, so we've got 3 different barriers before you ever get to the turbine building, concentrations of radioactive material on the order of 1 million becquerels, 1 million disintegrations per second in a liter. So think of a liter of Coke, and think of 1 million sparkles of light every second. That's the water, not in the nuclear reactor, not in the nuclear reactor containment, not in the reactor building, but further away in the turbine building. So what concerns me is worker exposure at this point. I think that, and my mind has flipped on this. I thought eventually in 60 years or so they could dismantle these reactors. But I don't think that's fair to the workers at this point. The exposure these guys are going to get in the process of dismantling the reactors is going to be extraordinary. Now, a little bit of physics here. The nuclear fuel is very hot in the first day and less hot the next day and less hot the next day. It's still physically hot. You can still see steam coming off these buildings, but it's much less hot than it was after the accident. And about 5 years out, there's not a lot of heat coming off the nuclear fuel. So 5 years out, a meltdown becomes impossible. So you have to cool. It's likely to be impossible now, but certainly 5 years out, it's impossible. So you have to cool the nuclear reactor building and the nuclear reactor, what's left of it, for about 5 years. But after that, you can turn off the pumps.
Oh, so they're still pouring water over the molten fuel?
Yes.
Seawater.
Yes. It's probably not molten, Helen. It's probably a solid lump that's very hot. But they're still pouring water over it to the tune of, tens of tons a day for each reactor. And that water is coming back out incredibly radioactive. And rather than pump it right back in, they are cleaning it with the mineralizer system that's very sophisticated, very expensive. But in the process now, they're creating hundreds of demineralizer resins. Think of like a Brita filter. Hundreds of those, but of course they're the size of a car, that are highly radioactive with cesium that's got a 300-year lifetime, that they're putting out on a field behind the plant. And still the concentration of radioactivity in the water is not going down because it's in direct contact with nuclear fuel.
Yeah.
So they've contaminated the reactor, the bottom of the containment, the torus, which is that donut-shaped thing, the reactor building, which is outside that, the thing that blew up, the floor of that is contaminated, and the building next to it, the turbine hall, should be the least radioactive, and it's still 1 million disintegrations per second for every liter. So my thought is now, considering the extent of this contamination, that it's not fair to the workers to have them go in and clean this. And I think if I were Tokyo Electric's management, a couple more years out after the cooling is completely done, I would consider filling up those containment buildings with concrete and walking away for 300 years. Obviously monitoring it, but I don't think it's fair to the workers to expose them to the extraordinary levels they'll receive if they were to try to turn that site back into a green field.
They couldn't turn it back into a green field. That's ridiculous. But anyway.
Yeah, you're right. Now, of course, the big concern would be you've got to make sure you've got it all captured and it's not going down into the water table.
But it will. And if you put concrete on it, you know it's going to keep going down into the water table, and you know it's going to keep contaminating the Pacific Ocean for the rest of time.
Right. So the solution, there is no good solution.
No, there isn't.
Absolutely no good. The solution would be to bore holes underneath and constantly pull water out from under the building so that whatever leaks down gets treated. So we're still back with these big demineralizers again. But I think, to my mind, I couldn't, as a manager, order a couple thousand workers to pick up extraordinarily high exposures to dismantle these plants at this point in time.
So, Arnie, another question. Is there only one turbine building where the electricity is generated from the steam, or does each reactor building have its own turbine building?
Each reactor building has its own turbine building.
Well, which is the turbine building that's so radioactive with 1 million becquerels?
Well, they all are. Unit 3 is worse. And it's interesting now, Unit 3 is contaminating Unit 4.
What?
And Unit 4, yes, they're connected. So we're finding water from Unit 3 leaking into Unit 4. And if it's leaking between the buildings, it's leaking into the ground next to the buildings too. Yeah. And the question is, how's it getting out? And a good friend of mine was an electrical engineer for General Electric. And he told me how. He said, a containment is not a monolithic block. It's got pipes in it for the wires to go back and forth. Electrical wires go in and out. And the wires are caulked with a rubber. Well, the rubber wasn't designed to handle this radiation level. The rubber wasn't designed to handle the heat. And the rubber wasn't designed to handle salt water. So all of these electrical penetrations between the reactor and all the other buildings on the site are leaking and are causing this radioactive material to move everywhere on the site.
Oh, I'm a little bit speechless. Okay, my next question. So the 3 turbine buildings each are exhibiting 1 million becquerels per litre of radiation. Is that correct?
The worst one is Unit 3 is 1 million, and the others are around that.
Okay.
I don't know precisely, but they're huge numbers.
Yeah.
Certainly not something you would send somebody in to voluntarily, scrub the walls.
So that indicates if in the turbine buildings, which is 3 buildings distant from the reactor itself, therefore you would extrapolate back and say that if the radiation is as high as that in the turbine buildings, it will be higher in each of the other buildings to the reactor itself, right? So you extrapolate.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And if they dismantle this building, they still have the same radioactive material. Now they've got to move it someplace where it's clean. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So it very well may be that the Japanese will say, okay, we made a huge mistake, but we're going to use the Fukushima site as the ultimate waste repository for everything we're finding on the site.
Right,
rather than contaminate another location.
Yeah.
This one, let's just call it a sacrifice and walk away.
Yeah, but then you're sacrificing the Pacific Ocean and the people who eat the fish from the ocean and the people on the west coast of America and people in Australia, because the fish swim everywhere. I mean, you are sacrificing the Pacific by leaving this stuff there for the rest of time, which will leak and drain consistently into the Pacific.
You're right. It needs to be constantly pumped out for 100, 200 years until they want to go back in and dismantle it.
Yeah, but what are our descendants going to say? There are 3 generations per 100 years. So say for the next 300 years, that's 9 generations of people. How will they be thinking? Will they be doing it? Will they want to do it? Will they have the apparatus to do it and the knowledge? And, I mean, we are assuming an awful lot, Arnie. We're assuming people 9 generations from now think the same way that we think.
I know. We also think that society will be functioning 300 years at least as high a level as we are. And we also have to figure, where's all this money going to come from? I don't see the international community saying, here, Japan, here's $500 billion. It's coming out of the Japanese treasury. Now, they're not admitting that. The Japanese are not admitting that their treasury is going to take a $500 billion hit. That right now it's $10 trillion this month or $10 trillion this quarter and $10 trillion another half a year out. But nobody's looking at the big picture and realizing that, $10 billion. Nobody's looking at the big picture here and saying, when you add up all of this for 50 or 60 or 100 years, you're looking at a $500 billion expenditure. Japan's population is aging and declining, so they're carrying a huge burden on an aging, shrinking population. It's not a great situation, that's for sure.
Well, let alone the number of malignancies and diseases that are going to accrue from this accident. I mean, we know that the data from Chernobyl shows that within the first 25 years, up to 1 million people have died. And we're going to talk about the next 300 years or 600 years as long as cesium remains radioactive. But there are other elements that remain radioactive for hundreds, thousands, if not millions of years. And they're similarly in the mix, as is the cesium. And so if you, and you have said yourself, Arnie Gundersen, that you think the Fukushima releases of radiation were 2.5 to 3 times greater than those from Chernobyl. So, and the Japanese population is much more densely situated than people living around Chernobyl. So if you multiply 1 million in the first 25 years by 2.5 or 3 from your data, you could end up with a figure like 3 million people dying in the first 25 years in Japan.
Well, I'm at 1 million. I am, feel the nuclear industry is obviously throwing barbs at my number, but they're claiming that maybe 100 people will die of cancer.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
But I use Steve Wing's data from 3 Mile Island, and he shows pretty clearly that 10,000 people died of cancer from 3 Mile Island, and of course we know 1 million at Chernobyl. So it seems to me, based on the fact that we had larger releases after Fukushima in a higher population zone, that 1 million people is certainly credible. The difference around Chernobyl is that on one side of Fukushima you have water, where Chernobyl was land all the way around. But it's but the industry knows that there will be. Japan's got a population of 140 million, and if you about a third die of cancer, so you're looking at roughly 40 or 50 million over that time period will normally die of cancer. So if I'm right and there's 1 million people, that's only a 2% increase. And so it will be extraordinarily hard to measure if you're not looking for it.
Oh, but people will be doing epidemiological studies, and I think that you're underestimating that number, because do you still stand by your data that 2.5 to 3 times more radiation escaped from Fukushima than Chernobyl?
Well, that was certainly, I'm certain of that for the noble gases.
Yeah.
For the xenon and krypton, there's measured data in the northwest quadrant for the first week of the accident, where every cubic meter, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet of air was 1,000 becquerels per 1,000 disintegrations per second for every cubic meter up that way. Now that's got to be causing lung cancers and whole body exposures that the industry's not willing to address. The other thing is that they found that apparently on March 16th, Unit 2 had an internal explosion. It looks fine. If you look at Unit 2 from the outside, it doesn't look bad at all. But it cracked the containment at the same time the operators had all of the vents open in the nuclear reactor. And a huge cloud of radiation was released on the 16th, and the wind was blowing toward Tokyo.
Right.
Now, there's not a lot of radiation monitors that early in the accident. There's chaos within Japan and Tokyo Electric, and yet no one is really willing to say, oh, my God, what was the exposure in Tokyo on March 15th, 16th, 17th? There's not a lot of good data, and what data there is, the Japanese are consistently downplaying. They're underestimating the exposure. But I was in Tokyo back in February, and I found on the ground 7,000 disintegrations per second in every kilogram of soil. That would qualify as radioactive waste in the States, and the Japanese government is saying, don't worry, be happy,
smile,
business as usual, right?
They say smile. Okay, so we've and so the point I was making by the number of diseases, not just cancer and leukemia, but diabetes, premature aging in children, increased incidence of cataracts, increased incidence of severe congenital anomalies that we've seen in Chernobyl. And in fact, today I'm going to interview a pediatrician who is a specialist in teratology, meaning damage to fetuses, about the incidence of congenital anomalies around Chernobyl, which is still ongoing, incidentally. We'll be seeing that around Fukushima for sure in the population. So we're not just talking about malignancies. There are many other diseases related to radiation exposure. And so what I wanted to point out as a physician is that the expense to the Japanese government and the people in general to care for these people and try and treat them is going to be enormous. And that is not being factored into the accident at the moment.
I think you're absolutely right. And on top of that is the generational genetic damage. There's a study out just last week about the radioactive butterfly damage, and what they're finding is that in successive generations, the genetic damage is getting worse. So that 3 generations of butterflies seem to have more genetic damage than the first generation. So there's obviously a lot more study needs to be done here, but we're looking at a damaged gene pool that won't manifest itself in 10 years or 20 years. It will manifest itself in a generation or two.
That's the most serious part of the accident and of anything nuclear. It's called genomic progression. Now, I've got some other questions, Arnie. You said earlier in the accident that that a lot of hydrogen was building up in the buildings units 1, 2, and 3, and they were injecting nitrogen into the buildings to dilute the hydrogen so there would not be a hydrogen explosion. Is the hydrogen still building up?
They failed. I mean, Unit 1, 2, 3, and 4 all blew up from hydrogen explosions. They may have had different causes and things like that, and I believe Unit 3 started as a hydrogen explosion, but then became something called a prompt moderated criticality, which is worse. Interesting, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit off topic here, but there was a Japanese study which is now calling the explosion in Unit 3 a detonation, not a deflagration. And that has to do with the speed at which the wave front traveled. And there's no containment in the world that can withstand a detonation shock wave. So that's something the nuclear industry doesn't want to address. But we now have TMI had an explosion, but it was a deflagration. Unit 1 at Fukushima had an explosion, but it was a deflagration, a slower moving shock wave. But Unit 3's explosion now, by authorities other than Arnie Gundersen, are now calling it a detonation.
Meaning that?
That means that the shock wave travels faster than the speed of sound, and it cracks the concrete or the steel.
But what caused the explosion? You were saying it probably wasn't a hydrogen explosion. Was it a nuclear excursion?
Well, it's not. I think it's something called a prompt moderated criticality.
What's that?
It's not a nuclear bomb. A nuclear bomb, the rate at which the explosion grows is it doubles every millionth of a second. A prompt moderated criticality doubles every thousandth of a second. It's still a blink of an eye, but what you saw at Unit 3 was a slower doubling than a nuclear bomb, but much faster than nuclear reactors are designed to handle.
So was it a moderated nuclear explosion?
The moderated means that the neutrons left the uranium atom very fast, but then they bumped into water and they attenuated and became what we call thermal neutrons. So we're really getting into a lot of nuclear physics here, but the net effect is that the growth rate of the explosion in Unit 3 was moderated, which means it doubled every thousandth of a second.
But it was a nuclear explosion. It wasn't not hydrogen, but nuclear. Would you say that?
In my opinion, it was a prompt moderated criticality. I'm not going to call it a nuclear explosion because that would be a prompt unmoderated criticality, and I don't believe that happened.
But it was related to the nuclear fuel.
Yes, but it was the rate at which it grew. I won't call it a nuclear explosion.
Okay, you're being very careful, Arnie.